Well, welcome everyone to our Crisis Jam episode 137. Happy to be here. My name is Dr. Chuck Browning. I go by Dr. Chuck in my role at RI International. I'm the Chief Medical Officer there and also the Medical Director of Behavioral Health Link. Been presenter several times and a very much frequent watcher of Crisis Jam. This is my first time hosting job, so bear with us. And I'm looking forward to talking with you today and sharing this. So today our feature presenter is going to be Dr. Ottilia Hunter, who's going to talk with us a little bit about grief and give an overview of that concept and tie it into crisis as well. As you know, especially for both new, but also a lot of us who've been on this for a while, our crisis talk site is the place to go to get the Zoom link and get the invitation put onto your calendar so that you can be connected to every week's schedule. It also has the links to all the videos and materials so that for those of you that have missed, like Angeline, who's going to be working on catching up, you can get a hold of that. Hey, Terrence, thanks. This has a reference page of where our recent jam highlights. As you see, we did a presentation last week, whereas now we'll be moving forward in this hosting role, and then also has links to lots of the different articles and things that are on our Crisis Talk and Crisis Now websites. So if it's disappeared from your calendar, get to this website. It's linked in the chat and download it to your calendar and it'll be renewing. And I think as we talked about it in our run of show that we'll have the glitch that made it disappear after 6 months will be gone and you'll be able to have it on a more permanent basis. This is still our same top 5 where you can see both the live Crisis Jam recordings as well as the number of views on YouTube. Our top 2 are still climbing in YouTube views. So any of you that go back and watch these will continue to help move total views up. And really excited because we've got some future presentations coming that are tied into the 2 top topics of all time. In the near future, we have something coming on about the youth, as well as something about the intersection of technology and tech conditions. Now we're going to go into some current news. So this article is highlighted and discussed this mayor in Reno presenting and talking about her crisis situation. And it really ties into today's topic about grief. She talked real briefly in the article about crisis and her experience in her crisis when multiple family members died from mental illness in a short period of time. And just a reflection of how that grief and her working through it. Interesting point about the article, though, she hid her name as she reached out for help and was told she wouldn't get access to care for 6 to 8 weeks. So also further push in our learning community to drive our goals forward of spreading these services so we all have access. Here's an update of news item number 2 for our 988 Lifeline performance metrics. And I'm super excited about being able to see this data, and when you compare it just in this past year since the launch, the fact that we have such amount of data, transparency, I feel like we always room to improve and have that push towards continuous quality improvement, but being able to have this data available is going to drive performance for all of us. Let's see, news item number 3. CMS did approve California and Kentucky's request to provide essential behavioral health services through mobile crisis intervention teams. They were able to do that funding through the state plan amendment, and they have that approval through that, as well as having the funding actually is going through ARPA. So feel free to check out the link in the chat to that article for more details. As always, we have the swag for the jam and swag. Oh, excuse me. This is actually information for 988 and for SAMHSA's page. So excuse me, I'm jumping ahead to the swag for the jam, which let's go on and move that forward. Have this in different Spanish options as well. Everybody needs to get their jam t-shirt. You can order and get on multiple different versions. I've got one of them on currently. We've got tees, hoodies, and caps, not cams, for that in both English and Spanish. And speaking of t-shirts, that leads us right into hot seat that's going to be coming up. So Karen is always looking for volunteers for the hot seat. You earn a t-shirt by being able to do that. I'm happy to welcome our hot seat contestant today and hope that I pronounced your name correctly. It's Margaret Marcoux. Did I get that right, Margaret? Yay.
Good job.
Margaret, introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Margaret Marcoux, and I am a 988 outreach coordinator, which means I'm the liaison between 988 and 911 in Wisconsin.
Great. So, Margaret, have you seen the hot seat in action before?
Yeah.
So you know, no pressure. I'm going to read out the question and then read out the answers, and then we'll let the audience give their points. But we really like to hear you talk through what you're thinking.
Okay.
So this is the plot, a searing portrayal of the impact of grief for the Jarretts, an upper middle class white family in a wealthy suburb of Chicago, after the accidental death of their older teenage son and the attempted suicide of their younger and surviving son. So the question is, what was this 1980 movie directed by Robert Redford? And our choices are A, Ordinary People, B, On Golden Pond, C, Terms of Endearment, or D, Places in the Heart. So
You know, I've
turn that into the audience, but what are you thinking?
I feel like well, first of all, I'm not sure, but I have seen, I believe, On Golden Pond and maybe Terms of Endearment a long time ago, but I'm not sure if I've ever even seen A or D. The plot doesn't sound like super familiar, so I'm hoping maybe I can,
Would you like to see the
you know,
audience view?
yeah, I would.
Well, if you've seen two of those, then you may be able to either know that that's one or rule out two and take it down to just a 50-50 choice. Oh,
Okay.
strong push for A.
Well, you know, that I'm glad that it's so decided, because that really helps me make my decision. So I will go for A, Ordinary People.
I always want to be like Regis and I say, is that your final answer, Margaret?
It's my final answer.
Okay. And our results? Yes, that is it. So not only did you get the win, you were going to get your t-shirt anyway, but you get the win on top of it's even better. Thanks so much for the pollers and for your participation, Margaret. I appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
So this quote is from Roger Ebert related to the content of the movie. And it's very apropos to what we're working on today in Dr. Hunter's talk. It's 40 years ago, Ordinary People changed the way movies think about grief, psychotherapy, Oscar campaigning, and Mary Tyler Moore. It was a radical ask for viewers to relate to the pain in this family war zone. And then right before our presentation, we're going to have our quote. So this is from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 2005. It is important to feel the anger without judging it, without attempting to find meaning in it. It may take many forms: anger at the healthcare system, at life, at your loved one for leaving. Life is unfair. Death is unfair. Anger is a natural reaction to the unfairness of loss. That's a powerful quote. So I'd love to introduce Dr. Atilia Hunter from SAMHSA. He's both a public health advisor to SAMHSA, as well as in charge of state opioid response grants and the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment. Dr. Hunter, are you ready to tell us about grief?
Thank you for having me. We can go to the next slide and the next one. 2 slides, please. Before we talk about grief, we're going to talk about what it is. And first, you have to have loss in order to have grief. The thing that most people don't realize, though, is it's the fact of losing someone or something. So loss does not necessarily have to be a person. It could be a change of lifestyle. It could be something that you thought was going to be there forever, and then it's gone. And so when you lose it is when you move into the state of grief. Next slide. So grief is the response to loss. It is physiological. It's the outward show of what someone is feeling internally. the thing that's important, I'm a clinician by trade, is to remember that people don't come in and say, I'm grieving. A lot of times they have somatic issues. They'll come in, they have headaches, or their stomach hurts, or they have backaches, or a number of, or a host of other things that they'll complain about. But it won't be until we begin to ask the questions that we really realize that what they're struggling with is grief. And once we figure that part out, then we can begin to do the work. Next slide. So bereavement is associated with excess risks of mortality, particularly in the early weeks and months after the loss. And the reality is, we know that it takes about 6 weeks for that grief to really set in after the loss, because for most people, you're dealing with the business of the loss, if that makes sense. So making preparations, firming things up, paying things, stuff like that. So you have to get into, you have the loss, the grief, and then the bereavement sets in, and it's a highly stressful time. It's when the brokenheartedness comes in, including the loneliness, change in social ties, living arrangements, eating habits, and for a lot of people, economic support, especially if it's the loss of a spouse or a caregiver. Those with the greatest needs of assistance for bereavement are probably not getting it. They don't know how to actually reach out to get it. And so this is where we come into play at, in asking the important questions so that we can help bridge the gap for them to the services that they need. One of the things I really want to talk about that wasn't talked about in the 1980s movie that we're dealing with now is the stigma around drug-related deaths. I had the opportunity to be able to talk to parents who had lost their children through a program with the DEA, and it's a different type of loss. It's a stigma around somebody who uses drugs. And so stigma, it discounts us, right? Or it discounts the person. And drug-related deaths are like this powerful stigma because it's the nature of the loss. So a lot of times families don't have the ability to really process it the way that they would normally process a loss, because they can't talk about the how. And that's something that we need to be able to offer to them. And you have to understand there's a public stigma, what people think, and then there's a self-stigma. It's what we internalize, and it's what leads us to the reduction in self-efficacy and self-esteem. So as we begin to dig deep, we have to be able to ask those important questions, and we have to be able to provide a safe space for people. Next slide. Coping with drug-related grief is oftentimes the going back and forth, right? The oscillatory aspect about how they feel. So there's the guilt. Did I do enough? There's a frustration of, not knowing that we acted in the right way or they acted in the right way. Always anger is associated with it. Intense sadness, relief sometimes, because if the loved one has gone through years and years of using, it's almost like a relief. And then shame. And sometimes people feel bad about the relief, but it gives them so much to not have to deal with that. And so helping them be okay with where they are is going to be important. It's reconstructing the meaning of one's life, right? So loss changes the loved one's lives in a fundamental way. Finding meaning through making sense of the loss. Survivors reorganizing their self-identity without that person. That doesn't mean that the hole will be gone. It just means that you have to fill that hole with other things. A lot of times what people do is they give back. There's a place in Maryland called Brooks Houses. It's a husband and wife who lost their daughter to a drug overdose, and now they have a safe space. They created a home for people, for young people who use, and it helps them to be able to find meaning with it and give back and try and eliminate this from happening to somebody else. Reorganization of the relationship with the loved one. So reconstruct a sense of meaning, but also one sense of self. Finding your own internal strength. And this usually happens over time, so we can't expect this to happen right away. Grief is a process, and people have to process through the grief. We can't say, oh, it's been 6 weeks, you should be over it. Absolutely never say that to somebody. It can take people, the original science behind it was 12 months, right? And what we now know is it takes people longer than 12 months to actually grieve. And sometimes it can take 2 or 3 years, depending on the relationship. And so we have to be open to that, especially as clinicians. And if you're working in a crisis situation, understanding that if the loss was 2 years ago and they never processed it, it's like it was just yesterday. Next slide, please. People will feel alone. I put this picture here because that's exactly how they feel. And part of what we do is we help become an extension of where they are to help them be able to get the help that they need. Next slide. So what is meant by relationships? When you lose somebody, it doesn't change that they were there, right? It doesn't mean that the relationship is gone. It simply means that they're not physically with us. So there was a study in 2017, and the author talked about it, saying that talking about loved ones and the loss was helpful because it allowed them a means for maintaining a connection and to reflect and process the grief associated with the loss. So the person is gone, but their meaning in your life or their meaning in somebody's life is not gone. And we have to be able to help them with that. So we can't say they're gone, it's over, you should, do X, Y, or Z. Next slide, please. So this is really what the loss cycle looks like. It looks like something totally out of control, right? Because it is. You have to let go of what you can't control. We want to allow people the opportunity to allow themselves to feel, right? And sometimes one person allowing themselves to feel gives permission to everybody else to allow themselves to feel, right? It's the processing of feelings, and it's being kind to those around you if you're the person who had the loss, because they won't always understand what you're going through, but they absolutely will be there if you invite them in to be a part of the process. Next slide. So we often say in therapy, and this is a great quote, grief is like an ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. This is perfect when talking about grief. And it's one of the things that I tell people, you don't know if you're at work and you feel it coming on and you feel like you want to cry, go to the bathroom, go to your car, give yourself a safe space to be able to allow your feelings to be able to come through. If you want to cry, cry. If you're going to get angry, be angry. If you need to pray, pray. Do whatever it is that you need to do, but you have to allow that to come. If you stifle it, it takes longer to process the grief out. Next slide. So we're going to talk about some coping strategies, body, mind, and spirit. And so as we begin to look at that, part of what we need to do for our body is take a break. And sometimes what people do in order to not feel is they get really busy and they tie themselves up. And next thing you know, they're exhausted. And then they show up in our offices like really exhausted, and we're trying to figure out how to get to the core of it. Same things I said earlier, it becomes somatic, right? And so what we know that works is exercise, eating well, sleeping, which are some of the things that people don't do in grief. And so those are the things that we really want to encourage them to do. Some relaxation and self-care activities, baths, self-spa time, deep breathing, which really works, progressive muscle relaxation. And a lot of times what I hear is, I don't know how to do that. I always refer them to YouTube. I refer them to the Calm app. Whatever they need to do in order to get to that place, I encourage them to do, because you have to find a way to allow your body to get what it needs. Next slide. Sleep hygiene is huge, right? And it's something that we struggle with on a regular basis, let alone when we're going through grief, right? And so finding a time, you get up and go to bed at the same time every day. Don't eat or drink right before bedtime. Be careful of blue lights and things like that. Set up a program for yourself. So these are the things we want to talk about with clients or patients when they're in crisis. And a big thing that we want to encourage is don't lie in bed awake. So if you can't go to sleep, get up, because your body needs to associate your bed with sleep. Next slide. This is really, really a strong quote also. Both optimism and anxiety require us to imagine something that hasn't happened yet. If we have the ability to worry about the future, we have the ability to imagine a better one. So, I talk to my clients about, good anxiety and bad anxiety, but if you're worrying about something, let's talk about how to make that positive so that it's not necessarily anxiety and it leads to something positive. And we're being realistic about this because as clinicians, we want to, thank you. Amanda, we want to reframe it. And so it gives them the ability to be able to see it in a different way. And sometimes that's all it requires. Next slide. So other things that staying connected, right? So don't feel ashamed of feelings. Schedule social and alone time because you need both of those, right? Maintain a list of people to reach out to and regularly check in. We hear about this in 12 steps, right? But we don't necessarily think about it in terms of our lives for those of us who aren't in 12-step programs and things like that. Make sure to spend time talking about something other than the loss. So again, there are other things that are happening in your life every day. Let's talk about those things, right? Get creative, virtual book clubs, Facebook, Netflix watch parties, whatever one needs to do, but try and steer away from it 24/7, the loss, and you want to be able to give your mind a break. Gratitude is another thing, right? Gratitude journals, 3 blessings or 3 good things exercise is a good thing. Creating a memory box is wonderful. And it's one of the things that I encourage people to do, especially around the times of the holiday. I tell them, don't let the holiday come and you haven't prepared, especially for all the first, you haven't prepared for it. So make sure you think on those things before it actually gets to that day. And then hope. Look at positives of the past. So you won't always be in the place that you're in because you've had things happen in the past that you thought you would never get through, and you did. You're here today and you're healthy, right? So let's focus on the positives of the past and look towards the good in the future. Next slide. Another coping strategy is spirituality, and this is not religion or being religious. This is just believing in something greater than you. It could be grass, it could be the blue sky, it could be a box, it doesn't matter, but finding meaning in and for the time of spirituality, right? So pray or meditate, right? Join an online prayer group or online meditation, use apps like Calm or free online apps, read spiritual texts, virtual services, either religious or spiritual, maintain a faith-based and or social connections. So in some way, make sure that this is a part of your life, because what we know is it is an excellent coping mechanism. Next slide. And here's the reality of it. You are not alone. You may feel like you're alone, but you're not alone. So now more than ever, we need to find ways to stay connected with our community. No one should feel alone or without the information, support, and help they need. And so one of the things that's really great about doing this in this online platform is we talk about 988. We didn't always have 988. And so if they feel like they're alone or they feel like they're in trouble, we know where to guide them to. Next slide. So even professional care, right? Behavioral health care is available. So some symptoms are normal, but prolonged, extreme, or symptoms getting in the way of everyday life are signs to get help. So turning to alcohol, drugs to cope are danger signs, as well as suicidal thoughts, right? So those with pre-existing mental health conditions are at the highest risk of need. So we want to be careful and pay close attention to those individuals. Research shows that loved ones from drug-related deaths are less likely to access behavioral healthcare or assistance because they see it as an unnatural death. So please, we have to ask the questions to make sure people are getting the help that they need. And here's a huge thing. It's okay to not be okay as long as we don't give up. So when people say, I'm not okay, we want to confirm that. We want to be in that place with them and tell them that's all right. It's okay to not be okay. We just don't want them to give up. We want them to keep pushing every day. Next slide. Here are some resources. SAMHSA's National Helpline. I talked about 988, but here's another helpline, also known as the Treatment Referral Routing Services, and the Online Treatment Locator, which is really great. Put your zip code in there. Can help people get the services they need. Even if you're not the person they call, you can give this information to people who need it so that they can get the help that they need. Next slide. These are some publications. A lot of them are from SAMHSA, and then I put some non-SAMHSA ones there. Reach out, download some things, get some of the resources that you could need. We talk about toolboxes when we're teaching, right? These should be part of your toolbox when you're working with individuals. You could hand somebody a sheet that helps explain how they feel, but download some of it, print it out, or find a way to transfer the link to somebody so they can get the assistance that they need. References, and next slide. SAMHSA's mission is to reduce the impact of substance abuse and mental illness on American communities. And these are free publications, grant information, and information for SAMHSA. And I want to thank you for allowing me to be here today. So we're going to continue the conversation and see how this goes.
Dr. Hunter, thank you so much for sharing. We're going to introduce our roundtable. I'm trying to see if there were any particular questions. We had a lot of people commenting on the benefits of the different quotes and their feelings about. Monica talked about the challenges when you were talking about stigma, also with mental health stigma impacting grief and loss as well. So before we go to the roundtable, and just a brief short answer, any thoughts about how you might apply thoughts about grief and loss to crisis care? You mentioned it related to 988, that it's a place as a support. Any thoughts on future goals towards that?
I think in terms of crisis care, you're most likely to see somebody come in crisis who doesn't understand that they're really grieving. And so being able to assess that, and there's a couple of tools that can be used. The inventory of complicated grief, which is just 19 items, or the Texas revised inventory of grief, which is just 8 items, right? And so sometimes just having those at hand to be able to utilize those for a really quick assessment will help us to be able to guide people in the right direction, because knowing what they're going through and knowing what the diagnosis or what they're geared towards is half of the issue, right? The rest of it is making sure that they have the services that they need and being able to provide them with resources.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter. I'm going to introduce our roundtable participants. It's Dr. Jean Bennett and Kristen Ellis. Hey, Dr. Bennett. Hey, Kristen. Let's see. Since you started first, Dr. Bennett, on showing up on my screen, any thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with us?
Absolutely. So I met Otelia at the time when I had been asked to do a talk on grief at the very summit that she described, where the parents of children who had died from an overdose were gathered. And I feel so fortunate that I had the chance to meet her. And I really feel that her information is a call to action for all of us. It's one more thing we need to keep in mind. And, you know, having lost family members myself to suicide and to drug-related deaths, it really kind of hits me hard. I lost my brother when he was 18. I was 23. It was my first day in the Navy. And I really had no clue of what to do about that. And I had lost my mother when I was 14. So this topic, how to cope, is just so important. I think what Dr. Hunter demonstrates for me anyway is a connection that I hadn't had with current information. And so I think the power of our own stories combined with the facts and science and experience as a therapist, really, that can, I think, lead to the reduction of stigma and then can lead to support for people who need it, but also policymakers who are really going to, you know, help us change the system across the country. So, so Otelia, thank you for your call to action and your way that you can bring this important information to us and sort of add that to our priorities and really look out for those families and individuals who have lost someone.
Thank you.
So that's, you're welcome. And also, I just wanted to mention, Otelia had a lot of wonderful resources. I also just want to mention, some of you may not know that you have a SAMHSA regional director, which is the role that I am in, and every region has one. If you haven't met your regional director, or if you want to be connected with any SAMHSA resources, we are all involved in the 988 priority and love to help move forward and support the states and communities that are trying to implement change. So thanks, Charles.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Bennett. And Dr. Hunter, we also had we had discussed earlier that, you know, loss and grief, especially in a crisis situation, it may not always be specifically related to loss of a loved one or death. It could be loss of multiple things. Any comments on that, Dr. Hunter? Or
I think that's one of the things that we really need to pay attention to. So many times people think the loss is only the loss of a person. But if you have somebody, especially in the older population, who's just retired, right? They go through an extreme loss and grief because so many of us, our identity is tied to our jobs or what we've done for the majority of our life. And so you have somebody retire who didn't like plan what to do next or the next step. They just knew they wanted to retire, and you see them go through loss and grief. You have people, believe it or not, pets, right? They're part of our families, and people will lose a pet and they get really, really down, and they don't understand that they're grieving the loss of a pet. It doesn't have to be a person. We see grief in so many different areas and so many different ways. Changing from one job to another or one profession to another could be part of it. Like you're looking forward to what's ahead of you, but you're grieving, what you're leaving behind. And so being very realistic. And when we have conversations with people, really asking them like, have there been any significant changes in the last 6 months or within the last year that maybe, they hadn't thought about? That becomes like one of those key questions, especially, for those of us that you are a clinician and you do work with people and they call you and they have these symptoms, but they can't put a name on it. Instead of automatically going to depression or anxiety, do the further exploration to see whether or not they've had a loss and if there's an opportunity there where some grief is present.
Yeah, Madonna wrote in the chat, grief can be the loss of a dream. And
Yeah.
I definitely have seen that associated with other presentations in crisis as a symptom. And I think we're going to it's time to introduce Kristen.
Hi.
Kristen Ellis, hey.
So I really love what you just said, Dr. Hunter, because I was about to say it myself, that it doesn't have to be someone or something, the loss, like it can, and I really love what Madonna said in the chat as well. Grief can be the loss of a dream. It can be the loss of an identity. It can be a loss of something you thought would exist, but never came to fruition or has not come to fruition. And the way that we respond to that loss is so important. Like, I feel like a lot of us will shove it down or, like you mentioned, turn to maladaptive behaviors when we don't have control of what happened or what didn't happen. But it's all about letting go of the things you cannot control. Control the controllables is what I always tell people I serve, as well as my therapist tells me when I'm going through grief. And also that grief isn't always around, but it's also not going to just forever disappear. If I'm grieving a loss of something that never happened or a loss of someone, it's gonna hurt more at times and less at other times. It just depends on how you handle that grief when it does come out. And for me, what has helped a lot is meditation and feeling those feelings, so that way they don't overcome all of who we are. And I really love what you said, Dr. Bennett, about like the power of our own stories. Is I have found personally sharing my own story of grief has been really important in finding my community and finding my wellness, as well as allowing others to share their story and to find that community as well.
Thank you for sharing your experience with that,
Yeah.
Kristen. Thank
Thank you.
I think one thing I would like to say also, and I don't want to get past, this to end before we say this, is dealing with complicated grief. If sometimes a person has had more than one loss in a year, they talked about the movie or the mayor or the governor that you talked about earlier. That's complicated grief. That's going to take a little bit longer. Or even for caregivers, anticipatory grief. So there's so many parts to this, there's so many angles to it that we have to make sure that we're, again, asking the right questions so we know where we're guiding individuals and ensuring that they get the help that they need. A caregiver doesn't know that they're actually have some anticipatory grief when you have somebody who you're caring for that's in hospice or even palliative care, right? But being able to have that conversation, take an extra minute to have the conversation so that you can be able to differentiate even the different types of grief. And for those of you who are not familiar with grief, I would highly encourage you to get training. PETSI offers it, where you could get trained in it. And there's not a lot of research on it. There's really some movement towards doing more research and lining this up. But, being able to get the tools that we need is going to be important in serving the populations that we serve.
Dr. Hunter, I'm so glad you were able to bring up that point. That was because I was going to make the comment that one of the challenges of this is, you know, in terms of our learning community, is to look for what are best practices in supporting this. And I really found some of the advice and tools that you gave and our roundtable gave very helpful as a frame to share. I also would encourage people to think through of the essential crisis care principles very much apply to some of the things that were shared today that are recommended in SAMHSA's National Toolkit for Crisis. So it's being trauma informed, it's being recovery oriented, so thinking like just like that reframe quote, thinking about the future. And then it's also really working towards helping that person, meeting them where they are and being collaborative and partnered with them, making it person-centered, because each person's grief is unique. So if you apply those principles, you're in the right ballpark of the approach to that. But I so appreciate your time, Dr. Hunter, and staying on and talking and interacting with our roundtable too. So we're going to move forward. Thanks again so much, Dr. Hunter.
You're very welcome.
So we have a new feature. We have the hot seat, and now we're plugging and showing off this idea and concept for the Crisis Center Spotlight. I have not heard any recommendations or guidelines about whether or not T-shirts are going to be connected to the Spotlight. I've just been making jokes that we need to share them for everyone on the whole crisis centers that participates. I doubt that's going to happen. Karen's laughing at me, but nice try, Dr. Chuck. So the Crisis Center Spotlight coming soon to our Crisis Jam is going to share opportunity for different crisis centers around the country to have a spotlight on the work that they're doing, how things are going with their 988 implementation, share resources, challenges. I'm really looking forward to this being a feature in the upcoming meetings and crisis jams that we have. So please feel free, if you have a call center and one of the 200 plus that are there, to be ready to share those and connect with Karen if you're interested and want to go over criteria, what would be involved, and how to move forward with that. Oh, David said, of course, and also for the call centers, what people are most proud about with what the work that they're doing. Now we'll move on to our SAMHSA update with Dr. Palmieri. Johnny there?
I am here. Thank you so much. Good to see everyone. Just a brief update today. Two things I wanted to highlight. One is that acknowledging our colleagues from the Center for Mental Health Services within SAMHSA, who are currently hosting a county policy academy for crisis services this week, which is running over the course of about 2.5 days, really working with county leaders across the country, supporting crisis system development with a very impressive team of consultants and experts who are working with these teams, recognizing some very unique challenges that rural communities face with respect to resources, workforce, and so forth. So wanted to just acknowledge that work and expect that there'll be proceedings and learnings that we'll get from the Policy Academy that hopefully we can amplify and disseminate for more widespread learning. And then the other really key piece that I wanted to highlight today is a recent press release that went out yesterday from the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Treasury on proposed rules to strengthen the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. So within those rules, there is a section on crisis services that is a request for public comment on ways that parity can be strengthened to incorporate crisis services components, including crisis centers, mobile crisis and stabilization services. There's a pretty lengthy paragraph there with a range of questions, both broad in terms of strengthening overall for the behavioral health crisis system, and then some very specific questions about marketplace plans, essential health benefits. And these are all questions that we have been fielding, and we have been working with our federal partners to try to get some of this language in the request for public comment. So I will throw the link in the chat, but I'm very excited that this actually was released, and I really would encourage all of you to take a look at the questions that are there and feel free to provide thoughts, comments, responses on ways that we can strengthen parity regulations, parity enforcement, specifically regarding crisis services, because I think that there are some opportunities here. So I will throw that in the chat, and those are all my updates for today. Thank you.
Thanks, John. How about we're going to go to our NASPIT updates now. Dr. Brian Hepburn. Brian?
Thank you, Dr. Browning, and want to thank Dr. Hunter for her excellent presentation. Very important subject, so thank you. At NASPID, we're very excited to celebrate 1 year of 988. A lot has been done over that year. States are very proud of it. The initiatives regarding 988 continue, and as Dr. Palmieri just talked about, the local jurisdictions are currently working with SAMHSA. So all of that is really good. We're having our annual meeting this weekend. This is for the behavioral health leadership in states and territories. And we will be celebrating 988, but also starting the work of the second year of 988. One day is set aside for what can be done to improve the relationships, especially regarding 988 and crisis services between tribal entities and states. In addition, the second and third day, most of the content will be related to our papers. Dr. Browning discussed some of that content last week, along with Dr. Piles, and we're looking forward to all those papers. And we're also looking forward to sharing a lot of that content with you in upcoming meetings. We think it's going to be a lot of good information that would be very helpful. So with that, I hope that you stay safe and stay cool. It is hot out there. Thank you.
Brian, you talking about the weather, Dr. Hepburn talking about the weather coming forward in Washington. I just cannot wait. So let's see. I am not sure. I know that Stephanie is not going to be in the meeting, and I was going to discuss with Seth, but I'm not sure if Seth is on the call. Seth, are you out there? If I don't, so I'm going to go ahead and just introduce and just share this and encourage you guys to check out the Crisis Talk article on done by Seth done by Stephanie, related to talking to Seth, who's been a contributor to Crisis Jams in the past. It's kind of a focus and story, a summary as Seth's his own personal lived experience and his family with a mother with schizophrenia, and him actually leaving his home at the age of 16 because of the stress and the challenges of that. But the push forward in his coordination with Utah and the Huntsman Mental Health Institute towards this national grand challenge, there's raising funds to work towards combating stigma. And I'm not an expert 100% on everything in the article, but I did want to share it and encourage you guys to be able to kind of take a look at it, reflect on it. It's a very meaningful push, and it really ties into some of the things that Dr. Hunter shared in relation to how stigma can affect your experience of loss and grief going along with that. It ties into so many things of what we face. Kevin, are you on?
I am here. Yes.
So Kevin, as we do this section, it's the promise of 988, and it's taking a look at what is this promise of 988 and developing care for those, and hoping that that care would be the kind of care that feels caring and moving towards that direction. And it really ties into the quote that Dr. Hunter shared about turning our future away from anxiety and worrying, but focusing on the hope and what positive things that can be done. So from your lived lens, first of all, if you could introduce yourself a little bit and talk to us a little bit about your experience and how you see that happening.
So I'm Kevin Fisher. I am the executive director for NAMI Michigan. I'm also the president of CIT International, and I'm the CEO of everybodyversesstigma.com, in addition to a bunch of other stuff. And I come to this work as a result of lived experience. My oldest son, Dominique, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia in 2007. Unfortunately, we lost him to suicide on June 27th of 2010. And so obviously, like many of us, this work is very personal and very passionate for me. The promise of 988 is tremendous because going back to my experience with Dominique, and even now, not being aware of what resources were available proactively and when he was in crisis, had a tremendous impact, I believe, on our outcomes. And so I believe we have a significant commitment or responsibility to the communities that we serve to make people aware of the resources that 988 makes available to us, how to proactively engage with them, because I think it improves outcomes for everyone.
So well spoken, Kevin, about that. And any thoughts about Dr. Hunter's discussion and how I'm sure you can relate very deeply to that.
Yes, I do. And I want to thank Dr. Hunter also for an excellent presentation. I feel like we were reading from the same Bible. I am very much a proponent of destigmatizing behavioral health care disorders, including suicide, because stigma is isolating. And it is, I love the fact that we're talking about you are not alone, but talking about it and experiencing that is two very different things. And I can tell you as a caregiver, as a person who's lost someone to suicide, so I've gone through the grief, and as a person who's experienced suicidal ideation myself after losing my son, I can tell you how alone I felt. I remember even with my son at one point, at the height of his illness, we had a conversation where we literally said, it's me and you against the world, because we didn't have the support of families and friends, and we didn't feel like we even had the support of the community and providers. And there was no malice to it. It's you don't know what you don't know. And because of the stigma, people weren't comfortable talking to us and giving us information and giving us that support. So we know stigma is the leading barrier to early diagnosis and treatment that leads to better outcomes. And we have to be more proactive with that. And again, making people aware of the resources that are available to them before a person reaches crisis, before a person potentially becomes a danger to themselves or others.
Yeah, so both in our article about the mayor and you describing your situation, Kevin, is and I agree, Sabrina said, well said, Kevin, is so well said, is that, you know, we're just talking about having care in general, access to care. And then this promise of 988 is a real focus on care that feels like care. So it's both, it's and both things, you know, being able to develop and work as taking things from this learning community and implement them across our whole continuum is so key for doing that. While I have you, because we do have a little bit of extra time, Kevin, if you don't mind, with your role at CIT International, any thoughts on the intersection and the work that you're doing there in the future and the promise of 988 for that?
You know, I think the intersection and the opportunities that lie with the intersection is really important. We were just having a conversation, some of my CIT colleagues, and we often say, and our chairman, Sam Cochran, has been quoted as saying, CIT or crisis response, it's more than training. It has to be a community program for it to be effective. It has to be the collaboration between those resources that are available when a person first calls 988. If there's a need for a crisis response, whether it's mobile crisis, law enforcement, whatever that is, understanding what those resources really look like, how to access them, what is what's the appropriate response? Because if there's not an imminent threat of danger, we don't want law enforcement on scene. And we say that in our CIT best practices guide. We know that if we can prevent crisis, or if we can de-escalate and not have law enforcement on site, that's optimal. But if there's a need for law enforcement on site, then we want the best trained, most compassionate, least intrusive response. But it's also equally critical that the community be a part of it, so it's not viewed as just a police training program. Because if we allow that to happen, we lose, because we will lose the confidence of the community that need us.
That's so well said, and I appreciate you being able to jump in and talking about that piece as well, Kevin. And thank you again for sharing your personal story with us, and I really appreciate it. Any other final comments for the group or for the community?
Lastly, if you're not registered for the CIT International Conference in Detroit, it's my hometown. I think we have very limited hotel rooms available, but please come and be a part of that. And I want to thank everybody for the work that we do. It is critical, it is appreciated, it is necessary. And I love the energy for this opportunity. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So next we'll go to federal updates with Joanna Rosen.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so we are expecting the Senate version of the Labor H budget bill to drop this week. So we're looking forward to hopefully being able to break down our priorities in the budget for next week for you all. But in the meantime, we do have a federal update. Things have just been a bit slow as Congress has been so focused on budget. But Representative Cardenas just yesterday reintroduced the 988 Implementation Act, along with Representative Fitzpatrick, Matsui, Blunt Rochester, Moulton, Napolitano, Beyer, and Raskin. So it is a bipartisan bill. It has lots of support, which is great. This bill is going to solidify funding for the 988 regional and local call centers to ensure 24/7 access to the call centers for any callers. It provides funding for community-based crisis response, which includes mobile crisis teams and the crisis centers. It also supports the crisis workforce development with increased funding for training, as well as scholarship opportunities. It also increases access to care by requiring all health insurance plans to cover crisis services. And it implements a national suicide prevention awareness campaign in partnership with a wide array of stakeholders. The text of this bill is pretty much the same as it was in the previous Congress version. In the 117th, there are a few changes that have been made, like the addition of the Behavioral Health Coordinating Office, which passed previously last Congress. So they did remove certain parts of that. And they did also increase the funding for the Mental Health Crisis Response Partnership Pilot. So that's a pretty exciting update that we have today. Great to hear it. We're hoping to see this bill get passed this session. But that is all we have for federal side today. And thank you, Chuck. I'll hand it back to you.
Dr. Chuck, you're muted.
Oh boy, that puts money in the jar when you mute and talk with the mute on. So apologize. So we don't have a state update today, but just to know that we still will have plan to have one in the next upcoming future meetings. Also, David had mentioned in the chat related to the states when Dr. Bennett at the roundtable had talked about being able to find where your regional director is, so you can hover over the state map and identify that. Next, just to update, as we've been sharing, Moving America's Soul and Suicide. This set of trailers has been shared. We've talked about it. There's, I think, 9 videos now that you can access and see related to again another focus on dealing with stigma, and it's the stigma about what people go through in dealing with suicide and Moving America's Soul on that piece. They're so powerful. If you haven't seen any of them, very educational, but they definitely move you, and they also definitely tie into some of the subjects that we've talked about today of dealing with loss and grief, and moving forward in people's journey. And this gives stories of hope and strength of people who have been moving forward and reframing that future, as Dr. Hunter kind of described it. Upcoming, I think in September, if I'm not mistaken, we have a plan. There'll be a webinar released that's going to preview the full-length documentary film that will be tying a lot of these stories and this central messaging about that is the crux and the center of the messaging and purpose of Moving America's Soul and Suicide. So please look forward to checking in on that and seeing that in the near future. And before we get to the future episodes, because we did have a little gap from where Seth was and not having a state update, I would love to call on one of my buddies who I see on this call line just to get his thoughts and reflections on today's topics, and speak on it from his lens, which always brings me some new insights and wisdom. Vic, can I call on you to join?
Absolutely. Let me see if I can find my face. There we go.
There's your
How you
face.
doing?
Hey, Vic, it's so good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you as
Share a
well.
little bit about what your thoughts were for today?
Yeah, Yeah, I think everything I've heard today is has really resonated with me. I think the things too to keep in mind is that whenever we have any of these kind of discussions, and whether we're talking about crisis services or whether we're talking about grief, I think it's always important to still remember that intersectionality. That sometimes these things look different in different communities. The access to resources may be different in different communities. I often think about like during the COVID pandemic when we saw a lot of loss, and I know for the community I come from, in the Black community, that closure with funerals and things like that, and having opportunities to interact with people when you have loss is extremely important, and it's something that has been historically embedded in the way that we interact with each other, and we didn't have an opportunity to do that. We were losing people during the pandemic. I think about indigenous people and how when we saw this disproportionate loss of older people, they lost a lot of their storytellers, a lot of their keepers of history. And so I think it's always important for us to think about those things, and especially when we're thinking about how we provide resources for people to access, just to keep in mind that oftentimes we have to think differently about how we provide those resources in different communities. And I always come back to this, that when we think about providing access to services, that access is not just providing physical proximity to traditional resources. It is about providing access to resources that are relatable to my lived experience and resources that I am willing to utilize.
That's so key, Vic. I mean, it really ties into what we was just talking about with Dr. Hunter, is that those essential care practices, if there is a call to action to drive best practice in dealing with loss and grief, that guideline is that it should be from a trauma-informed perspective, which should create that engaging connection that has thought and consideration of the lived experience and of different cultures and different diversity. So I so appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you.
Thanks for being willing to come on, Vic. It's always good to see you.
You too.
So going forward in our next two episodes, I'm really excited about our next one. This panel coming up on episode 138 next week for our Crisis Jam should be super interesting. One of our top 5 ratings and viewings of all time in our Crisis Jams was related to youth. So I expect this to be a hot item too. And so it's going to be the presentation is going to be led by Haley Winterberg, who had been a part of our special edition on youth in the past on our high ranking Crisis Jam. And she's going to be speaking with 4 teens who work on different crisis lines. I'm not sure if I have the list myself, but maybe someone that has it can put it in the chat if they know the specific. There's 3, I think, throughout the country that are doing the teen crisis line, and she's going to be leading and engaging in a discussion. Oh, there they are. It's Teen Line, Teen Lifeline, and Youth Line volunteers. But she's going to be coordinating with these teens and having a discussion about their work. I think it's going to be extremely interesting to get that viewpoint and looking forward to it. We don't get enough teens sharing the Crisis Jam. I remember we've had just a few that I've enjoyed watching when we've had them participate in the past. So really look forward to seeing that next week. In the next, this ties into in episode 139, we're going to have folks from the Central Maryland Regional Crisis System. So Adrian Bridenstine and Shauna Brock to be able to talk about the development of their system. So it ties into a previous Crisis Jam, I think back over in July a year ago, but related to Tequila Terry, who was at that time talking about her work in helping promote the approval and funding for services in the Maryland area in multiple different regions. Oh, sorry, it was 2 years ago. It's the COVID years go fast. It was the summer of 2021. So they're following through with what they are doing with that funding and the systems and the designs that they are moving across in their region. Really looking forward to being able to move that forward as you see it in the next upcoming. So with that, I am failing in that I'm ending at 1 minute ahead of time, but I will fill the time to get to this with a summary of things. I think we did cover some really good things today about grief. and loss and thinking about that. I think it is really, at least in my experience and all the different layers of crisis work that I've been a part of, grief is such an important factor many times. And so the tips of thinking about how it works, what people are going through, the experience from a lived lens, to think about it from a diversity perspective, as we design our systems, a little bit of a call to action of thinking about continuing to organize what are those best practices as we work towards thinking about in the different layers of our crisis continuum, how do we support grief? Moving and reframing some of the things, as Dr. Hunter shared, is a key part towards connecting and giving that care that feels like care when people are in crisis, when it's tied and complicated to loss and grief of different things that are going on in their lives. So I appreciate you. Thanks for watching. It was a very enjoyable time in doing my first hosting, and take care. Bye.